Hey guys, sorry. This is my third attempt at this photo or a photo, but movie or video because first time I got interrupted. The second time I was doing it entirely with my mic off. So I'm going to do this again and it should be fun. Okay, so in supplement to the outline that I had provided on my wiki page, I'm providing this video to kind of break down my thought processes within my outline and kind of explain like why I wrote down what I wrote down, because in my mind it's a lot more clear. However, on paper, when I'm just summarizing things that make sense to me, I would like to also make sense for everyone who wants to use my outlines as a part of their research, or maybe if they want to use it as a part of their own like syllabi or whatever, like whatever you guys would like to use it for. So I'm just going to be discussing this. I don't really have a PowerPoint or anything like that, and I don't plan on making a PowerPoint since there is the outline, but I am going to discuss this, and you guys can follow along with the outline as well. It's also downloadable. So so I'm just going to jump into it. So I first started off with the historical roots and trajectories of instructional communication. In the introduction, it has been noted that like instructional communication can be traceable about 4 decades ago. Um, and the definition that's provided by Moet and Beebe, 2006, is that instructional communication is defined as the process by which teachers and students stimulate meaning in the minds of each other by using verbal and nonverbal messages. And so that kind of gotten me to think quite a bit about communication and what we know about communication and its definition. And of course, it's instructional communication. The name is like the name is communication is in the definition, but we also know that like communication is such a vast like broad thing, and that we know that we provide meanings to symbols, and symbols being like words or figures or things that are out there in space, whatever that might be, is that we're providing like a meaning to that. And just because we're providing a meaning to that, it allows us to kind of think about instructional communication in a different way. Instead of just seeing as like student teacher, now we're looking at it from more so of like, what does the message mean, and what are the roles in which we're playing as students and teachers. And that actually gets defined later on in the chapter as well, which I'm going to go over. um, and so it goes into the historical overview of instructional communication, and it said that in the 1970s, Barbara Liam Brillhart and Robert Kibler were responsible for creating the first instructional communication division in ICA, or the International Communication Association, and that was in 1972. But I wanted to like place a quick note as well, because um, sometimes a lot of us kind of like to stick with textbooks of whatever textbook says, but that's not necessarily the case. And we've learned that like in recent times throughout the media, is that we've learned that just because it's old and we might not understand it, and it might not be the Western ideal of thinking, doesn't mean that it's not actually valid, and it does have representation, especially within our culture and the way academia plays out. So this is just kind of like a side note. I put it in my outline as well, but we have to kind of think of like the ancient Grecians and then like indigenous folk and their practices on ways and in ways that they taught, and how they live civilization and how they progress to learn and things like that. So, like, yes, it's really cool that we actually started an instructional teacher-based thing, but then like when we're looking at like shamans and like Grecians, like Socrates, right? Like Socrates was like literally killed for what they were saying he was like corrupting the youth, but it was actually like taking a new approach into teaching, and nobody really liked that, right? And then even Plato himself was actually super against writing, because that was like a whole new form of like teaching and recording history. But like Plato just thought that like everything needed to be oral, everything needed to be spoken. But we know now that that's not the case, right? So that's when I came across this part of historical overview of instructional communication, I just kind of wanted to bring that into mind as far as what actually was going on, or what may have been overlooked because of the Western ideal of what is ontologically correct and what isn't correct, and pedagogical things and whatnot. So I just kind of wanted to bring that into light. But going on with like the historical overview of instructional communication, um, between the years of 1972 and 1986, scholarship in instructional communication became vastly recognized, and two of the major communication journals, Communication Quarterly and Communication Research Reports, displayed a lot of instructional communication research, actually. Some of them were more specific than others, but there were, it was quite notably known that these two journals were publishing instructional communication research. And then also during that time, West Virginia University became the first university to actually have a doctoral program specifically for instructional communication, which was very interesting. It also goes in to note that, there were, yes, of course, there was a surge of instructional communication research. However, a lot of the researchers in instructional communication wanted to solely kind of contribute to Communication Quarterly because it was such a vast, and they were just taking all sorts of instructional communication research and scholarship there. So that's also very interesting to note. And then the divisions of instructional communication actually broadened during that period as well. So regional conferences, national conferences, NCA, Western, things like that, they had broadened the divisions of instructional communication as well. So now we're going to be going into the interdisciplinary foundations of instructional communication. Firstly, by looking at educational psychology. So educational psychology is a field of psychology that focuses on the aspects of how a person learns, not necessarily the relational aspect, or I'll take that back, the way that student and teachers learn together, which would be instructional communication. Educational psychology is primarily looking at the intellectual processes of how a person learns specifically. So keeping that in mind, so they both instructional and educational psychology, instructional communication and educational psychology, have three things that are really, really in common that I actually found extremely interesting. One being cognitive learning, which would be the acquisition of knowledge. The next one would be affective learning and how students feel about what they are learning. And then the last one would be behavioral learning, and it would be the development of physical skills. And so, like I said before, educational psychology is mainly focused on how the person learns and how they're actually using this. But in instructional communication, we're really looking at how the teacher-student relationship is allowing them to learn. And so when we're looking at this, we definitely want to see that the instructor is able to interact with how the students and how they develop these particular traits. Even though they are very similar, there is more so emphasis on, in instructional communication, there's a lot more emphasis on the way the student-teacher relationship and how that happens in these three traits. That's cognitive learning, affective learning, and behavioral learning. And so that kind of went into the next factor of it, which would be pedagogy. And so what I wrote for pedagogy was kind of this kind of small thing about pedagogy, unlike educational psychology, focuses on the exploration of teaching and methods to deliver content. This means that pedagogy, instructors, and researchers are more concerned with how the students are motivated to learn, the methods on which to teach students, and how classroom management strategies influence learning, i.e., what is the content and how are you teaching it? So I found this to be extremely interesting because even now we see quite a bit of faculty members, not within just our department, but in many other departments that I've heard from undergraduate students, is that for some of them, it's I've taught this way for a number of years and it's always worked. I don't know why you're failing. And then others are how are you doing this? And why are you not paying attention to how the student is learning, right? So I think and even it mentions in the book that actually there is a large debate about that. But for me, I found this to be extremely interesting because even in my own class, I sent out a survey to ask my students, what will you need for you to successfully complete my class and be able to learn something? Because I don't want them going into my class and not being able to learn anything. They should be able to learn everything that they can possibly learn. So I asked them about that, and a lot of them said, I need like financial resources, I need health resources, I need a laptop, I need internet. So it was about me being able to deliver the content that was able that would enable them to have it everything accessible, even though my whole Blackboard course is all mobile friendly. If they said they needed those things, it it was my job, I believe, to give them those things because it's about how I'm delivering the content and how they're receiving that content. And so I like to think of it in that sort of way. So I guess I would be on one side of this debate, but I actually found this section to be extremely interesting. And then we get into the next session, or section, which is communication with message focusedness. And that kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier in this video about like what is the message and how do we perceive it. And this section here is specifically looking at verbal and nonverbal messages and how those apply to instructional communication. And so I wrote down here, within instructional communication, these verbal and nonverbal messages are essential to teaching and learning as they are perceived to determine the interactions between teachers and students. And so then they broke it down into 3 different models, right? And I found this interesting as well. So this is being understood as of communication messages has been defined in 3 different models. And those 3 different models are communication as action, communication as interaction, and communication as transaction. And I'm gonna go over each one of those right now, but I definitely found this one to be extremely interesting, especially because I'm a media scholar, so I definitely like messages and their representations. Okay, so the first one would be communication as action. And so communication as action is really kind of like looked at as like a linear process model. And so the linear process model is essentially like sender, message, receiver, done, right? One way. Like there's no transaction, there's no feedback, there's no nothing. It's like I am the teacher, you're the student, you listen to what I say, and that's all, right? There's no, in my mind, in my perception of this model, there's no real learning taking place because there's no like questioning of the knowledge, there's no questioning of what's actually going on, there's no reciprocation, there's no transaction, there's nothing here. So essentially in this section here, we're just looking at like a straight base model, sender, message, receiver, that's it, right? And so there's no real interaction with the context or the text of what's going on. Nextly is the communication interaction, or communication as interaction. And so here we can see communication as interaction. One second. So communication as interaction. So this allows for the receiver, I guess like we would still look at it as a communication process model. No, actually, yes, this is a communication process model. This would be that the sender would send a message to the receiver would decode the message, then the receiver would respond and then also be able to give feedback at the same time. Feedback being like the body language of the receiver, but also be able to respond and ask questions. And this one would be more so not transactional, but I would say um, almost like going through like Instagram or Facebook, like making comments and then like moving backward for that, you know what I mean? Because even like through social media now, we can use emojis for representations of emotions or even body language now, you know, like there's a middle finger on it, so we can do that. Um, but yeah, I would say that this is more of like a feedback loop sort of deal. So communication interaction is more fluid instead of communication as, what was it again? Communication as action. Um, However, it's not entirely fluid as the last one, that what we're going to go over right now, which is communication as transaction. So communication as transaction, it serves as a type of communication that allows the student and the instructor to give knowledge that is valued within the discussions. And so this is a huge one for me because I really enjoy seminar classes and I enjoy being able to like share knowledge and give back to the class. But in the others, you can't really see that because those models are essentially very fixed, right? Communication as action is just linear, straight line, there's nothing to it. And then communication as interaction is very much of a loop sort of deal, right? Like We change positions as the messages are received. However, communication as transaction is an extremely fluid model, right? So we can be sender receiver and we can be contributor and non-contributor. And because of this model, I believe that that it really kind of like brings out what we're going to go into next, which would be like the rhetorical tradition, like of inner the rhetorical traditions of instructional communication. That is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, guys. But yeah, like it, because it's the fluid of it, it challenges this idea of like there is a tradition of how like teachers are supposed to interact with students and so on and so forth. But we know that that's not necessarily the case. Um, so yeah, and then that would go into the third point of my outline, which is the rhetorical tradition model, right? Or not model, sorry, I keep saying model. So in the book, rhetorical traditions is, and I had to quote this because I couldn't really like find a good way to explain this, but rhetorical traditions is said to, it centers on the instructor's use of verbal and nonverbal messages to influence or persuade students with the goal of either changing or reinforcing their attitudes, beliefs, values, or behaviors. And that's from the textbook. And so I don't really agree, nor do I like this way of teaching, because I don't think that like cloning a person to get them to think and know what you want them to know because you want them to know it, it takes away from their humanity and it takes away from their own thought processes and being able to handle and manipulate information, or not even manipulate, but also to process the information and to get their own thoughts out there and to like actually think about that stuff. But then this section kept going into Aristotle's three proofs of ethos, pathos, logos, and it explained how in the rhetorical tradition of instructional communication that ethos, pathos, logos is used firstly by using ethos is whether a student believes a teacher is credible and therefore is more likely to believe what the teacher says when they are speaking as their perceived notion is one of who is credible. And so those are my own words, but essentially, yeah, like it allows for the student to even like have a determination of whether or not they're going to believe what the teacher is saying to them or the instructor is saying to them. And it's all based upon their credibility and how they perceive their credibility. And I found this one to be extremely interesting, but also like in this in the notion of like rhetorical tradition, like a sense of persuasion is not necessarily what is going to get like the best outcome of instructional communication, I believe. I know that this is just history stuff, but even still, it's like, you know. Um, but in any case, the next one goes on to pathos, and that refers to the emotional efforts and work that is placed in the work from the teacher and the student. This will be determined on how the learning environment is influenced, right? So the way that the students perceive the intent of their instructor and the way that the instructor perceives the intent of their students will have a great influence on how, in this way of rhetorical tradition, on how something is actually going to be displayed, right? And then the last one is logos. So this refers to the logic that is placed within the messages that are delivered during class. The more reasonable the message is, the more likely students are willing to receive the message. So, of course, when we're breaking it down onto like theory, right? Like ethos, pathos, logos, that would be the theory of Aristotle's three proofs. When we break it down like that, like rhetorical tradition actually seems fairly useful. But again, like we don't want to persuade students to believe what they want them to believe. We want to give them the information and like foster a healthy and like discoursive, I don't know. Anyways, we want to foster a healthy learning environment, right? Like we want there to be discourse. We want people to talk. We want people to share ideas and share thoughts and share like how their opinions and whatnot. And this way of instructional communication of rhetorical tradition doesn't necessarily kind of like look at that as much as the next one does, which is relational tradition. And so in relational tradition, it gets defined by McCroskey and Richmond as two people coordinate or coordinating to reach a shared perspective satisfactory of all. Of paramount concern is the relationship between the two people and the perceived well-being of the other, right? So so this kind of goes back into what we were talking about as communication as transaction, right? So it's two people, in this case it would be teacher student, and the student wants to learn and the teacher wants the student to learn. They want them to grasp the material and be able to take it on with them. And in our context, especially in my class, I want them to have all the resources that they need because I care, you know? And so in this, I wrote down like these relationships among instructors and students are described as emotional expressions, goal orientation, communication, and etc. As relational tradition places emphasis on interpersonal communications or interpersonal relationships. And I really like this idea of relational tradition of instructional communication because it definitely like reinforces how students and instructors can benefit from one another, not only by having a relationship with one another, right? Like having a good friendship, mentor-mentee sort of deal, but also by being able to contribute back to the classroom and creating a healthy learning environment, excuse me, by contributing back, right? Like, so our students aren't stupid. They have knowledge. They know what they're talking about. It's just being able to give them those resources in that healthy environment for them to contribute back to us, right? Because there's not really one way that is actually super valued. We have to value all knowledge in that form of, you know, ideologies. In my opinion, you know, this is kind of what I'm getting out of the chapter. So, like I said, I'm just walking you guys through it. This is very informal. I'm not trying to lecture at all. Um, but in any case, we'll go on to the next section, which is the current state of the discipline. And so in this section, the section will discuss the research that has been done within the last 10 years, and we'll distinguish three primary goals / questions. And these questions are, how are the different methodologies represented in instructional communication literature? What theories have been used by instructional communication scholars over the past 10 years? What constructs have been investigated by instructional communication scholars over the past 10 years? So it goes into like an integrative review. And so what I kind of looked at it here was that they took about a decade, right? So they took about a decade of articles that were done on instructional communication, and they determined that, and they determined that the ones that had empirical evidence were those that showed more atheoretical and interdisciplinary works, not some that actually contributed back to the discipline essentially, but were using theories and other things from other disciplines to help promote the use of a new strategy in instructional communication, right? So that's kind of what I took from them, from there, and it was interesting. I mean, like, you know, that in itself is empirical data, but um, yeah, I just found that portion to be interesting. I really kind of like think I need to go back into that section, but you know, that's what I took from it. Maybe you guys can add something. That'd be great. Okay, so the next section goes into future instructional communication scholarship, methodological advances. And so here they were talking about longitudinal design data, which I thought would be really, really interesting. However, it would be really interesting to see the design of this longitudinal data, in my opinion, because when you have longitudinal data, you know, like it can be skewed, especially if you're trying to do like instructional communication research, only because like first you have to look at like demographic. If you're looking at college students, like college students have like anywhere from 4 to 6 professors in one semester. And so, like, if you're doing it just on your experiment alone and just following them, these students are going to be like faced with all of these different types of like teaching styles, you know? And so for me, it was just kind of like, okay, like longitudinal designs might work if they were isolated to just one teaching style, right? I mean, any style outside of that would be like, oh, well, then that's skewing your data, right? So, I mean, it all depends. Like, I mean, if it's survey model, then I guess like that might work. But in my opinion, I don't necessarily see this one working out too much. But again, it was just their prediction. So these are just my comments. Didactic data collection and analysis. Um, of course, like I am down with didactic data analysis and collections. Like I am a mixed method researcher myself. So I love this sort of deal. This definitely would be something that I'm for 100%. As far as using a qualitative and a quantitative on this, um, a quantitative like easy, like just send out a survey to like hundreds in the same university and you should be okay there. However, the qualitative is where would be interesting, and I believe like if they're going to do didactic data collections, they should definitely have a new theory in mind, I believe, and that's just my thing. But it would definitely kind of break down a lot of the nuance that's out there about instructional communication, and you'd be able to like solidify more things about it, right? Like you would be able to essentially develop a theory on your mixed method study and what you found in it, and maybe you could debunk a theory and try something else, so I like this approach to instructional communication. It's something that I would recommend myself. So nextly, we're going to talk about theoretical advances. In the section of theoretical advances on the textbook, it basically said like there is none. However, there are a few that were going on, and I believe I wrote them down. I know I did. Instructional is made to understand. Oh yeah, here we go. Um, so they did one on learning from humor, such as the instructional humor processing theory, and they also did another one on emotional response theory, which I thought was actually pretty interesting, like especially the humor one. But I do remember in another class that like doing too many jokes actually makes you sound like a bad teacher, and so they just kind of like you just kind of like lose your credibility with your students that way, which is interesting, but okay. But yeah, essentially the theoretical advanced section was just saying that like, there's still ongoing research in instructional communication, but yes, a lot of the theoretical portions of instructional communication are taken from a lot of other disciplines, which is cool. Like we're interdisciplinary anyway, so. Um, but as far as like producing their own theories, I believe that's what this section was actually covering. Okay, and so lastly, we are going to finish off with content and context advances. Communication technologies and instructional communication is very, 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 very pertinent at this point in time because we are now all virtual, and so all sorts of technologies, including Zoom, which I am using to record this video, um, is essentially in the way of learning. And like currently right now in the tech field, like everything is essentially like, how does VR have anything to do with like learning, distance learning, LTI softwares, like learning technology information softwares? What can we do to advance them so students can learn? What is the best way for students to learn online? Can we create an augmented system where students are able to learn? Like that is like so hype right now in the tech field that is just ridiculous. So if there was a boom from like the 1980s to the 1980s, like I guarantee you in like the next 2 years, it's going to be all instructional communication stuff, and it's going to be all stuff about tech and how students learn online. I guarantee it. If you haven't seen a few now, you will. Like it's all over. So I give this section like little commentary just because we're living it. So, but yeah, I did. Yes, this communication technologies and instructional communication is just huge right now. So, and then that goes into the next section of identity studies, and identity studies in instructional communication, I believe, are are kind of a big thing, you know, because like we need to recognize that there's a lot of intersectionality within instructional, you know, within students. And if we're not recognizing that, then we're doing a disservice to students. And if you're an instructional researcher, right, in communication, then you should be definitely looking at this and identifying the aspects of like teacher-student learning relationships and understanding like, oh, this student isn't learning effectively because of X, Y, and Z. And what this section is saying is that the lack of representation is a huge factor into why students don't learn. And so the prediction for this one is that allowing for intersectionality to become a part of the student-teacher learning process will prove extremely useful, which I agree, you know, and that's something that in, you know, when I went to meetings at the TRC, like there were discussions about representation, and this was a main discussion, and I'm sure it's been going on for years, but, you know, essentially like in this day and age, we're going to need it. So that's what I believe. The next portion of it was a biosocial approach of instructional communication, and essentially taking like socio-physiological responses and figuring out that. Um, I don't know if that would ever go past an IRB. I mean, I'm sure it would, um, but yeah, that would just be extreme, like in my opinion. Like inducing stress on a student and seeing if they learn better. I don't know. Being supportive, of course, being emotionally expressive and to regulate your emotions. That would be actually really interesting. But the hormonal influences and inducing stress as parts of learning. Now that would be something that would just be extremely interesting, and I would probably want to learn something like that. But I don't think that I would ever want to be in that study. So yes. But yes, essentially adding in like the physiological portions of like our brain and how it functions, and seeing how if, like teaching and learning has a response to that, I think that would be fairly interesting. And then the dark side, lastly, the dark side of instructional communication. And I wrote like the dark side of instructional communication involves students that seek to hurt the reputation of the instructor. These are acts that are made to make the instructor look bad by using cyberbullying techniques. That's what we've seen here, and you can actually do that on Rate My Professor. I've heard that when you apply for any type of instructor or professor position, they actually look at that because it's public information, and so, you know, like why not? Basically like an online SOT. So very interesting. But they also say that however, high levels of clarification show that students are more satisfied with their teachers. So, you know, to just be up and clarify everything, I don't think that that's such a difficult thing. But yeah, so this is my summary of chapter one. I hope you guys find this useful. I found it very useful for sure. So yeah, that's all I got. Thanks, guys.